This is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we want to explore the potential negative ramifications from the governor's budget proposal on the availability of emergency medical services around New York, with providers raising concerns about changes to Medicaid payments. To discuss this issue, as well as the impact of a new law requiring the development of county emergency medical system plans, we're joined by Thomas Coyle, president of Monroe Ambulance Transportation and chair of the United New York Ambulance Network. Welcome to the show, Thomas.
Thank you, David. Thanks for having us.
And we're also going to hear from Bryan Brauner, CEO of Twin City Ambulance in Erie County and the Government Affairs Committee Chair for the network. Thanks for making the time, Bryan.
Thanks for having us again, David.
So your organization is making the case that the elimination of a Medicaid crossover payment covering that population on Medicare as well as Medicaid would ultimately cost EMS providers in the state $20 million in lost revenue. We can get to why this is being done, but for starters, what would it mean to see that drop in revenue for EMS providers all over the state, which come in a variety of forms and fashion?
Yeah, thanks for the question, David. As you probably know, but in the governor's executive budget, Part M of the budget eliminates the Medicaid crossover payments for dual eligible patients. What that means in plain English is, the low-income senior has both Medicare and Medicaid. Medicaid currently covers the remaining 20% balance of the Medicare 80% payment, and the proposal eliminates that protection for ambulance service. So ambulance providers cannot bill for these patients for that 20%. We cannot refuse service, and the state removes that payment. It simply becomes an unreimbursed mandate.
And in terms of the consequences of something like that, is that something that is a deal breaker for EMS providers? Is it something they can swallow in their balance sheets?
Yeah, as most people are familiar, the ambulance services in New York State are already underpaid. Medicaid reimbursement is not even close to covering cost. So, elimination of the crossovers means between $25 and $30 million for the industry in New York State.
So it's my understanding that this would bring consistency, and that's the governor's language, to Medicaid payments on Medicare crossover claims, aligning the payment rules with what's already being done for a number of other types of services, with ambulances and psychology services being the outliers. Other than the fact that you'd like to have that money, is there a reason why psychology and ambulance services should be outliers? Is there any other reason why it makes sense to carve them out?
So, David, you bring up a great point, and I don't know the legislative history of that, but they were carved out. So we'd have to go back to figure out why they were carved out. But that is part of every operations budget at this point. This is not a prospective payment that is being cut. It's very real, translates into wages and benefits for our EMTs and paramedics, and translates directly into the number of ambulances that are available to respond to emergency calls. So when we remove this, we're taking money out of operating budgets. We're not forecasting and doing something for an out-year budget to reduce the amount of expense. So why the exception? I don't know, but the exception does exist and has been a part of all of our operating budgets for a very, very long time. The other side is when you look at the other services that aren't ambulance services that are getting crossover payments, they were actually included in this budget in targeted inflationary increases. So there was some sort of offset put into place for them. The ambulance services weren't included in that targeted inflationary increase, and we're forced back into stagnant Medicaid rates and stagnant reimbursements that do not cover the cost of providing service, as those costs continue to grow through other burdens that are imposed by New York State with insurance and with vehicle prices and taxes. So it's a very real impact. It's not prospective. You're taking $25 or $30 million out. That's $25 or $30 million. That's not going to EMT and paramedic wages, and that's not going to having operational ambulances prepared to respond to calls around the state.
Well, is there anything else in this budget that the governor is proposing that might offset that lost revenue or make it easier to swallow because of changes to, say, maybe rules and regulations? Or when you look at what the governor is proposing, is it basically this measure that you're going to have to deal with and has the biggest impact on your operations?
Yeah, it's this measure that absolutely has the biggest impact on our operations, where the governor did propose some expansion of services. There is no aligned funding. For example, community paramedicine was introduced as a broader service, which we certainly support if it's voluntary and there's appropriate funding attached. Right now, it's just an expansion and an increased burden of service that would integrate EMS more into the healthcare system with no associated or attached reimbursement. And I think you introduced this conversation by saying that the purpose was to bring alignment to the Medicaid reimbursement schedule. We understand that and absolutely can support that, but we believe the crossovers have to remain as a bridge until the reimbursement schedule gets adjusted to reflect the actual value introduced by New York's ambulance providers.
So, as a backdrop for this conversation, the legislature moved through a bill that the governor signed at the end of 2025, requiring local governments to develop and maintain comprehensive county emergency medical system plans. Does that type of requirement have any impact on your operations, in the sense that it's one thing to plan, it's another thing to say, hey, we're making this plan and we're going to make sure that these operations are funded?
So yes, and we are in favor of those plans. We think there are critical questions that need to be asked about who answers 911 calls when they're placed, about which agencies are assigned, about the reliability and availability of agencies. Those are all things that historically have not been looked at comprehensively and have not been introduced as part of a critical infrastructure plan. So we are very much in favor of it. And we think a lot of the state is already well served by our member organizations, by our allies in emergency medical services. And there are going to be some gaps identified. When those gaps are identified, then it's about creating a solution for them that might include expanded operations for our members or for other agencies. But the first step in any plan is identifying the problem. And I think this bill is a really good step towards enabling the communities to identify problems, with the caveat that we have to exercise caution in terms of introducing new services. Every time you introduce a new service, you're further diluting the one or the biggest constraint that we have, which is the certified EMTs and paramedics. We can't spread them across more services and expect to actually boost capacity. As we have a finite number of EMTs and paramedics, we need to use them as efficiently and effectively as possible, allowing them to take the most number of calls possible and treat the most number of patients, and not simply staff ambulances that are creating readiness without utilization in other communities. So as the bill is written, I think it's great. I think it will enable local communities to really evaluate their capacity and identify areas where they can improve operations. And it does require the incorporation and use and feedback from existing operators, which is important. The people who have been doing the work should contribute to how the work is done in the future.
Is there an expectation then that as you do that evaluation, that some of these municipalities might say, I guess we're going to have to actually fund, say, a volunteer network with some of our resources? Is that the obvious next step from your eyes?
It's a possibility. I wouldn't say that it's an expectation. I think some people have perceived that bill that was signed into law as an unfunded mandate for counties to provide emergency medical service. I don't think that's what the bill does. I think it requires that counties evaluate their emergency medical services, determine what their needs are, what their expectations are. Maybe it does push a little bit more of a burden onto local governments, especially in lower volume rural areas where the patient volume and fee-for-service model alone cannot sustain an ambulance service. Maybe there has to be something there to enable that ambulance service to operate, but we won't know that until the evaluation is done and they determine what resources are available and what expectations are for all of those communities.
Well, we've been speaking with Thomas Coyle. He is the president of Monroe Ambulance Transportation and chair of the United New York Ambulance Network. Thanks so much for making the time, Thomas.
Thank you, David.
And we've also been hearing from Bryan Brauner. He is the network's Government Affairs Committee chair and CEO of Twin City Ambulance in Erie County. Thank you, Bryan.
Thank you, David.
Support for the Capitol Press Room is provided by New York State United Teachers, a statewide union of nearly 700,000 professionals in education and healthcare.